I hope you folks are enjoying the study of the life of David as much as I. There are a lot of books been written on the life of David, and some of them are big, thick ones. David is sort of a picture of you and I. He wasn't a perfect man, but he feared God. And when he did wrong, he fell on his face to make things right with the Lord. And we're seeing him in the early part of his life right now. For some weeks, we've been seeing him as he flees from the king Saul. Saul has recognized that David is a threat to his kingdom, to take his place on the throne. Pretty soon we're going to get past this phase in David's life, but we're not there yet. It'll be soon. But tonight in 1 Samuel chapter 23, we're going to finish up the chapter that we started last week. We studied the first 14 verses. We're going to finish up the chapter tonight as we go verse by verse and then make some spiritual applications that we could apply to our life from this study. Begin with verse 15. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. There was nothing new that Saul was trying to take David down. And it continued for a long time, a matter of some years. And so we see that this is what we're seeing tonight. David's life continues to be in danger. You have to remember what a formidable enemy Saul could be. He had the whole army of Israel at his disposal. David had about 600 men who were loyal to him. David could not go to battle with Saul and his army. And so his only thing he could do was to hide and to flee and wait on the Lord. Sometimes that's all we can do. Wait on the Lord. There's danger all around us. There's danger from a physical sense. How our great land of America is getting to be more dangerous all the time. Some of us were talking before the service of when we were young, many years ago. We lived in an old farmhouse, and we had 3 doors that went outside. And not one of them had a lock that worked on it. You didn't lock your doors. You take off and go to Detroit to see your city slicker relatives and leave your house unlocked for 2 weeks. Nobody would ever bother anything. You never even gave it a thought. But that's not the world we live in today. And so we ought to be able to identify with danger. Then we notice in the next verse, and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. Jonathan had once before gone to David to verify what David already knew, that his father Saul fully intended to take David's life. And at that time, Jonathan had asked David, when you do come into the kingdom, please remember my family, my offspring. And if I'm alive when you come in, I will be loyal to you, because Jonathan was to be the next king. But God had chosen David, and Jonathan knew that, and he accepted it. Jonathan is a picture of an obedient child of God who's willing to accept the place that God puts him in and to be faithful in it. And now we're seeing here the very last time that Jonathan and David are able to get together physically on this earth. Jonathan went down to where David was and found him in the wilderness of Ziph. This wilderness of Ziph was a very dense forest, a lot of hiding places. I'm sure a lot of you have, when you're my age, you used to watch Robin Hood on television. How they lived in Sherwood Forest, I believe it was, and we'd be against the corrupt government that would not take care of the poor and so on. It was that type of situation, David and his men, as they hid out in the forest. But Jonathan was able to find David and go to him one more time, and we see that the motive that he went to him was, Jonathan went to strengthen David's hand in God. He went to encourage him. In verse 17, Jonathan is speaking to David, and he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. And thou shalt be king over Israel. I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knoweth. Saul even had admitted that probably David would be the next king. And he knew that his son Jonathan would accept that. And that's what he's saying to David. And then we see in verse 18, and they two made a covenant before the Lord. I think we understand what a covenant is. It's an agreement or a promise to each other. And they did it before the Lord. And David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. This was the last time that David would see Jonathan. They were very close, closer than a brother. Had great respect and love for each other. But they realized that they would not be able to be together until God removed Saul from the throne. And Jonathan hoped to be able to be there to see that. Then we get to verse 19 and we see the danger rearing up his head again. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the woods, in the hills of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? The Ziphites, they were a nomadic tribe that settled in no particular place. They were like gypsies. But they habitated those woods, lived off of hunting and fishing and lived that primitive way of life. And of course, they were wanting to get in favor with the king for him to give them things. And so they were willing to betray anyone for gain. And so they went to Saul to tell him where that David was. Satan's always got plenty of people employed to try to work against the Lord and his work and his people. And this will be the case here. When they get to the king, he gives them audience. And they said to him in verse 20, now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. It's kind of like somebody going rabbit hunting. The Ziphites were going to sniff him out in the open for Saul to make him, for him to be an easy prey for Saul and his army. Of course, they weren't doing this for nothing. They were expecting something from it. Then we see in verse 21 that Saul listens to their proposition and he answers them back. And Saul said, blessed be ye in the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. Saul is saying that he wanted God's blessings upon these Ziphites because they were helping him to go against David. And that shows you Saul's pitiful condition. He was working wholly on emotion, human desire, not any spiritual leadership from God. But he's using God's name. There's a lot of that goes on in our world today too. A lot of people use the Lord's name for profit, for gain, for fame, that are not in tune with the Lord. And that was Saul's case. Then in verse 22, Saul's going to tell him to do something to prepare for the ambush. Verse 22. Go, I pray you, prepare yet. In other words, there's some more work for you to do before that I go in after him. Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there. Saul wanted to be very sure he knew exactly where David would be. And he sent these folks back to take care of that detail. And the reason that he wanted to be sure was he had been chasing after David for a long time. And somehow or the other, David had always been able to escape and not be taken by Saul. Now, you and I ought to know why, because God protected him. And you're here tonight, my dear friend, because God protects you, protects me. And Saul made the statement concerning David in the last part of verse 22. For it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. In other words, David is real crafty. He's hard to catch. Saul knew that by experience. He'd been after him before. And so we see the plan that Saul and the Ziphites have got together to try to once for all take down David. Then he goes on continuing to talk about that plan in verse 23. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself. And come ye again to me with the certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. See, the Ziphites are going to have to work for their reward. Saul was a great warrior. He'd fought many battles. In those days, the king, he was the commander in chief, but he led the battle. He went into the battle with a spear. He also went with 2 or 3 men around him to protect him. They didn't want to kill the king. But he'd lead the charge until the battle started, and then he would back off. Saul knew all about battle. He knew all about pursuing the enemy. He was a great warrior in and of himself. And he recognized how David was. No doubt he also understood that God was with David. And so we see in verse 24 that these Ziphites, after their conversation with Saul, they understand what they need to do. And in verse 24, we see that they're going to go back to the wilderness of Ziph and carry out the plan. Verse 24 says about the Ziphites, and they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. David kept moving around. He didn't stay in one place. When they got back to the wilderness of Ziph, he wasn't there, but they located him. He went to the south, to another region, to hide. And they located him and sent word back to Saul where he was. Verse 25, after word got back to Saul where he was, and they were sure about it, and Saul also and his men went to seek him. And they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. In other words, the Ziphites told Saul where David was. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. I believe Saul was pretty confident that he had a good chance of taking down David this time. It was well planned. Probably the best plan that Saul had ever had to be able to take down David. Then we get to verse 26. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. In other words, David saw Saul coming and he ran around the other side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. In other words, they were able to surround David. And that was not an easy thing to do. But it looked bad for David. He's in great danger. David and his men, as I said, are outnumbered greatly. And things did not look good for David. They were able to encircle them. Sometimes things don't look good for us. But the Lord's able to bring us through it. Many times I've seen that. Maybe a physical illness, maybe some other thing. But the Lord brings us through it. And we look back and we praise Him for it. Through many dangerous trials, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. We know that great song. So here we see that David is in this predicament now. He's never been in this predicament before like this. And it looks like there's no way out for David. But if you're a child of God, as David was, and God has a plan for you in this life, He can bring you through it. Yesterday morning, I went to see Brother Kinsey. He's always a blessing. And he and I, we talked and we prayed. And he told me, he said, look, I'm in good hands. If the Lord wants me to come through this, I'll come right through it. And if He don't, then I'm ready to go to glory. I said, praise the Lord. That's right. That's that blessed hope we have, isn't it, brother? He said, absolutely. He said, I'll put myself in the Lord's hands, and everything's going to be the way He would want it to be, and that's what I want. And so we see this. David's come to a point of things are looking terribly bad for him. Physically speaking, probably there was nothing that David could do and his men to defend themselves and escape. Escape looked impossible. But we know the saying, there's nothing impossible with the Lord. Nothing impossible with the Lord. And we're going to see the providence of God working for David. God intervening in a way that we would not even have thought about to cause David's life to be spared. Verse 27. And there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, haste thee, and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Here Saul is up in the wilderness of Maon, chasing after David with his best fighting men. I think there were about 3,000 of them. And he's neglecting to defend his homeland. And the Philistines, they know this, and they're always Israel's enemy. And now they're invading the land of Israel. And all of a sudden, a messenger comes and tells Saul, you better come. The Philistines have invaded Israel. That forced Saul to leave David and run to fight the Philistines. Now, do you think that was a coincidence? Absolutely not. That was God. That was God working. And He works that way in our life too. So we see Saul had no recourse but to back off and leave David. Verse 28. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place Selah Hamalekah. Selah Hamalekah. Now that's kind of a long name. Kind of reminds me of what I saw on the news. There was on the newscast, they were interviewing a lady doctor in New York about the COVID virus. And her first name was kind of strange, but her last name must have had every letter in the alphabet, about that long. And so the newscaster said, I can't even attempt to say your last name. And so this is a long name. It's in Hebrew, it means rock of the escape. In other words, the place of escape. That's what they named it after this incident. So after Saul has backed off and God has spared David once more time, the battle's not over totally yet. In verse 29, and David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. En Gedi was a little village. It was an oasis in the desert, which is very common in that part of the world and was more at that time as well, where there would be springs of water, and anywhere there was water, there would be trees, there would be shade, and people would settle there in that area. David went to where he could be taken care of. It was down at the west end of the Red Sea. In other words, on the other side of Jordan, near a hill called Masada, where the Jews took their last stand against the Romans later on. Now, as we come to the close, I want us to make a couple observations. Going back to verse 16, we see where Jonathan went to strengthen David's hand in God. We're told in Hebrews 10:25 to not forsaken the assembling of ourselves together, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. When we come together as a group of born-again Christians, it strengthens us. When we come into the Lord's house and the Lord comes here with His presence and His Spirit, it strengthens us. When someone comes to my house that's a brother or sister in Christ and comes in and sits in fellowships with us and we talk and enjoy each other's company, it strengthens us. We need that. I'm not against television. I probably watch more than I should. But television has really hurt the fellowship that people used to have in their homes with their neighbors. I remember many years ago seeing on a newscast, they showed the picture in New York City of an elderly lady who was very poor, that lived in one of those little old walk-up apartments on the 5th or 6th floor in a tiny room. Nobody saw her for a few weeks, and they went in, and of course she had passed away. But before she passed away, she went and wrote with a marker on her television screen, "This is the last friend that I had on the earth." I don't want a television to be the last friend I have on the earth, do you? We need each other. The Lord's people need to stand together. Then in verse 18, we see, as we said before, that they made a covenant or an agreement, a promise to each other, that they would be loyal to each other no matter what happened. The psalmist said in Psalms 25:10, "All the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth unto such as keep His covenant and His testimonies." We have a song we sing, "He will keep His promise to me, I know. All the way with me He will go." But when the Lord saved us, He didn't save us just to keep us from going to the bad place. He saved us to serve Him and worship Him and, yes, be His friend. What a friend we have in Jesus. I don't like to disappoint my friends, do you? When I have, I feel bad about it. And we know no one ever had a friend like Jesus. And so we ought to keep our promises to the Lord. Psalms 55 said, "Gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice." This is God speaking. If you're saved, you're one of those saints. When the Lord saves us, He changes our mind about some things. And he gives us a certain desire that we didn't have before to do what's right and to stop doing some things that we've been doing. Remember, a good example of that is Paul, back when he was called Saul of Tarsus. He was a very educated man and a well thought of man in the land of Israel. And he hated Christ and he hated the followers of Christ. He was a ring leader to bring them to prison and to have them stoned to death. I mean, he was a bad man. He went and got authorization from Jerusalem to go to a place called Damascus in Syria to capture Christians and bring them back down to be judged, in many cases be stoned to death. But on the way up there, God intervened, revealed himself to Paul, and Paul fell on the ground on his face, trembling. And you know what Paul said? Lord, what will you have me do? Wow. Now that's a big change. He acknowledged that Christ was Lord. And he wanted to know what he wanted him to do. Rather than being his enemy, he became his friend. And he preached the gospel of Jesus Christ for many years on 3 continents. And he sacrificed to do it. He was whipped, he was imprisoned, he was stoned and left for dead. And yet he never quit preaching. As long as he lived, even in prison. The psalmist said in Psalm 51:17 about the sacrifices of God's people to the Lord. The sacrifices of God are a broken and a contrite heart. O Lord, thou wilt not despise. In other words, we need to come humbly before the Lord and be thankful for all he's done for us. It's so easy for us to complain all the time. And we all do some of it. There is a sense that you need to take your complaints to the Lord before you take them to anybody else. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there, the song says. None of us do that perfectly. But I'm thankful for one thing. Jesus kept his promise. He promised to come down to the world to take a human body and go and be sacrificed as the only acceptable sacrifice that God the judge could accept to save a people from their sins, for them to inhabit the new heaven and new earth, and to escape the wrath of God against sin. And he went all the way. He kept his promise. That ought to motivate us to try to keep our promises to him. And in closing, the last point, David's escape. God made a way of escape. You and I are born into an impossible situation with a sinful nature. And our natural inclination is not to run toward God after we begin to understand we're sinners against God. And there's no way that we, without God helping us, can come to him. We see the psalmist said in Psalms 124:7, when he talks about the fact that the Lord can liberate and deliver from sin and damnation, the psalmist said, our soul is escaped as a bird out of the snare of the fowler. The snare is broken and we are escaped. He set me free. He set me free. Glory to God, he set me free. Isn't that wonderful? No, nothing I can do for him will repay. We can't repay what he's done for us. But we ought to have the desire to honor Him with our life after we're saved and know we're saved. But you know and I know that as long as we live on this earth, we've got several things that will hinder us. One is our own self. There's my worst problem right here, this old flesh. Even though I'm saved, I have the new man, my soul is saved, but the old nature is not. Somebody once said it's like this old nature after you're saved is like a dead dog that you got on a leash. You got to drag that dead dog around everywhere you go. You go to the supermarket. Here, you're dragging the dead dog with you. We never get rid of the flesh until we leave this flesh. Let me tell you something. When we escape this flesh, if we're saved and go into God's presence, that is a great liberation, a great deliverance. I have a desire to live. Like Sue Kinsey told me the other day, I'm prepared, but I just assume to stay here for a while. God gives us that instinct for self-preservation while we're here. But we'll not need it when we leave here. And so we go through life, we have a lot of things that don't go exactly right the way we would like for them to, that frustrate us, and sometimes people let us down, and we even let ourselves down, and the others that will be against us for no just reason. And so there's always going to be a good measure of that. Sufficient unto the day is the trouble thereof. But no trouble comes in your life that God does not allow for some purpose. And we may not understand the purpose. Only God knows. Paul told the church at Corinth in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians 10:13, there is no temptation. And that word temptation in 1 Corinthians 10:13, it means testing or trial. It's not the same as a temptation if you're tempted to do something wrong. There's no trial or testing taken use, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. The night is the darkest just before dawn. And sometimes we go through valleys. But the Lord is with us. And David has been going through some valleys. As we close, the last passage I wanted to read to you, talking about our deliverance and our escape. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. I love this. Where he's been talking about our eternal inheritance that we have in heaven. Wherein ye great, because of your eternal inheritance, ye greatly rejoice. Though now, for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations. In other words, that temptation there means testings and trials. Not every time that you have things go wrong, it's because you did something wrong and God's punishing you. That's our natural way to think about things. I think I told you about the time that I had gallbladder trouble in Brazil. And I had a parasite in my bloodstream, and they couldn't operate till they killed that, because if it got in my liver, I'd be cooked. It took them a while to kill out the parasite, and by the time they did, my gallbladder had ruptured. So when they opened me up, they had to open me from here to here. They took me back to my room, and I'm laying there with hoses running every direction. And some well-meaning old country bumpkin preacher came in there with a Bible so big he couldn't hardly pack it. And I'm not sure he could even read and write. There was a lot of those kind around. He took one look at me and he said, "Man, What kind of horrible thing did you do to get in this situation? Boy, that was comforted. You know what I told him? I didn't know what to say for a minute, and then a thought came to me. I said, brother, I don't know. But if I find out, I ain't never going to do it again. That kind of set him off balance. He just turned around and left and shook his head. No, not every time that we have trials and troubles is because we did something wrong. An athlete is training to be successful. They have to go through a lot of pain and a lot of discipline. The Lord lets us go through things. And many times it makes us stronger spiritually. So we need to understand that. We have many trials through life. But He's able to deliver us. And when the Lord begins to work on a person that's lost and knows they're lost and not saved, only He can deliver you. And you're going to have to give up on everything. Not a thing you can do. You know why you can't do anything? Because there's nothing you need to do. Jesus paid it all. He paid it all. And because of our nature, the way it is, contaminated with sin, in and of ourselves, we can't accept that. We still want to do something. That's why you have so many religions that says you got to believe in Jesus and you got to be baptized. There's a lot of them kind of churches around here. You got to believe in Jesus and then you got to live it. Then you're cooked because you can't live it. Jesus lived it for you. He was punished for you. And only He can give you the way of escape from the penalty of your sins. This is the lesson the Lord gave us tonight. Let's stand and have a couple of verses of a song as our custom is and offer the invitation.